Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive.
It's great to be back.
I'm excited about this one.
Me too.
This is a topic I know we've danced around a little bit on previous episodes, but today we're really zeroing in.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a deep dive into what it really takes to lead in machine learning engineering.
Yeah, like not just be a good ML engineer, but how do you really step up and
lead a
team, lead a function?
Exactly. So what are those practical strategies, the forward-thinking approaches, the kind of things that define top-tier leadership in this really rapidly changing field?
For sure.
So think of this as your sort of like curated guide.
Your shortcut.
Yeah, your shortcut to getting seriously knowledgeable about this.
Yeah, all those aha moments, all the stuff that's going to stick with you without,
right,
having to read like tons and tons of books or articles.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing is that for this deep dive, we've got a particularly interesting source. We've got excerpts from an in-depth interview for a director of machine learning engineering position at TechInnovate Solutions.
It's fascinating, yeah.
Which is, come on, that's a
dream job.
Kind of a dream job title.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing where, you really got to be on top of your game.
Absolutely.
Like, this is not an entry-level position.
No.
This is someone who really needs to know what they're doing.
And we've got this really unique opportunity to kind of listen in.
Yeah, behind the scenes.
Yes, it's Abinash Mishra. He's a senior manager in AML engineering at TechInnovate Solutions.
And he's interviewing Tarun Kumar.
That's right.
Yeah, for this potential director position.
Through this conversation, we're going to see what kind of questions get asked.
Yeah.
How does the candidate respond?
What are those practical examples that he brings to the table?
Exactly.
What's his vision for the future? All of that good stuff.
Absolutely. So I think we should just dive right in.
Yeah, let's go.
And, a really foundational area that came up right away was
governance.
Yeah.
Observability.
Yeah. So Tarun actually shared a really interesting real-world example from his time at DataCore Analytics.
Okay.
They had a fraud detection system.
I mean, that's
pretty classic use case.
Yeah, it's classic.
But it wasn't just about getting the model to work.
Right.
It was making sure it worked reliably.
Yeah, within all these boundaries.
Within these operational boundaries.
Yes, totally.
That are so important now, right?
Especially in a highly regulated environment.
Well, and that's exactly what they were dealing with.
Okay.
At DataCore Analytics. They needed this fraud detection system to not just be good at catching fraud, but also adhere to all these internal risk policies, external audit standards, PCI compliance.
Right, so it's not just the technical performance, it's going to fit into this whole ecosystem.
Right, and they were processing a huge volume of transactions.
Okay, like how many are we talking?
5 million a day.
5 million a day.
Every day.
That is serious scale.
Yeah. So you can't just be like...
Right, that's not something where you're just going to, wing it.
Right, you need some robust monitoring and control in place, right?
Okay, absolutely.
So what were they actually doing? What were the steps that they were taking?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what they were doing in practice.
So they had this really comprehensive sign-off workflow.
Okay.
So it wasn't just like, okay, we checked the box, we're done.
Yeah, it wasn't just a formality.
Yeah.
Like, they really embedded these bias audits.
Right, into every step of the process.
Yeah.
So they were looking at things like disparate impact.
Okay.
Like, are different groups being unfairly affected by the model?
Right.
Equal opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. Ensuring fairness across the board. Plus, they had really rigorous version control.
Oh, okay.
Every single time they deployed a model.
Smart, very smart.
Because, if something goes wrong...
You need to be able to roll back.
You need to know what changed, when, why.
Yeah, and who did it, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of that traceability.
And I think their choice of tools for observability was really interesting, too.
Oh, yeah. I'm always curious about what people are using in production.
Right.
Because that tells you a lot about their priorities.
Yeah, and also tells you, what they've learned.
Yeah, what's worked, what hasn't worked.
Exactly. So they specifically chose Prometheus and Grafana. I mean, those are pretty...
Those are pretty standard tools for...
Yeah, I mean, standard, but
powerful.
But they're powerful, right? They're really good at collecting and visualizing all this real-time data.
Yeah, like the heartbeat of your system.
Exactly.
You can see exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
In real time.
And they specifically mentioned that they considered some other options like Datadog and MLflow.
Right. Those are all popular options.
But they found that for their use case, Prometheus and Grafana
They fit better.
fit better?
Yeah. Especially with their Kubernetes environment and all the alerting capabilities they needed.
And they were ingesting a ton of metrics.
Right. So it wasn't just like, oh, something's gone wrong.
Yeah, it was like instant.
It was like immediately detecting.
Detecting any kind of anomaly.
Yeah.
Right.
So they also did something else that I thought was super interesting.
Okay, what's that?
They meticulously logged.
Like everything.
Yeah. All the model predictions.
Uh-huh.
And the distributions of the input features
Okay.
because they wanted to proactively detect things like data drift.
Right. Data drift, concept drift.
Yeah. When the incoming data changes over time,
Yeah.
or like the relationship
Yeah.
between the inputs and the target.
Yeah, the world is changing, the data's changing.
It's constantly changing, yeah. And they have these automated alerts.
Smart. Yeah, so it's not just looking at a dashboard. It's like, boom, we've got a problem.
Something's wrong.
Yeah.
We need to look at this right now.
Yeah, it's like that early warning system. That's built right into your AI.
It's like having that canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
So what's kind of interesting is that he actually shared the results of taking this approach.
Okay, I mean, that's what I'm always interested in, right? Like, what's the...
Like, does it actually work?
Yeah, does this stuff actually make a difference?
So they saw a 40% reduction.
Wow.
In the time it took to resolve audit findings.
That's huge.
It's huge because that means not only are you more efficient, but you're also saving money.
Absolutely, yeah. Compliance costs can be a big deal.
Oh, especially in a regulated industry.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
And their model downtime also decreased.
Okay.
By 30%.
Which means more reliable service.
Yeah.
Less interruption.
And this is the big one.
Okay.
They managed to reduce a demographic parity gap.
Okay. So that's
a measure of whether different groups are receiving positive outcomes.
From the model?
Yeah, from the model at similar rates.
Right. Fairness.
Yeah.
Making sure that your model isn't biased.
Yeah, so they reduced that gap from 15% down to 5%.
That is a significant improvement.
Yeah, and they did it without significantly compromising the model's overall accuracy.
Okay, so that's really important.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people think, oh, well, if we want to be fair...
We have to sacrifice performance.
Yeah, it's going to hurt our accuracy.
But this shows that you can actually do both.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ideal scenario, right?
Right.
To have a model that's both fair and accurate.
Right.
And this is a great example of how you can achieve that.
Yeah, so this is just one example. But it really highlights this idea that governance and observability.
Yeah.
These aren't just abstract concepts.
No, they're not just buzzwords.
They're not buzzwords.
Right.
They're practical necessities.
Especially when you're working with...
Especially at scale.
Yeah.
Large-scale, high-stakes systems.
High-stakes systems.
Yeah.
And this is like a blueprint for how to do it. Yeah, it's a great example of how to put these principles into action.
So I think the key takeaway for our listeners is that if you're operating in that kind of environment, this is the level of rigor.
This is what you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and it's not just a one-time thing.
Right.
It's like a continuous process.
That's a continuous process.
Of monitoring, of improving, of making sure that your systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right, and doing it fairly.
And doing it fairly, ethically, all of those things.
So this kind of naturally leads into another important topic.
Which is?
Bias mitigation.
Yeah, and how that plays into the whole governance and observability picture.
Right, because if you're not mitigating bias, you're not really governing your systems.
You're not really in control.
Right.
Yeah, you're kind of letting the models run wild.
Right, and Abinash, the interviewer, he specifically asked Tarun about how he approaches this balance. The balance between improving fairness and maintaining the overall performance of the model.
Right, because that's the classic tension.
It is.
Right, like everybody wants a super accurate model.
Right.
But you also want it to be fair.
And sometimes those things are at odds.
They can be, yeah.
But I thought Tarun's response was really interesting.
Okay.
He really emphasized using multiple fairness metrics. So not just relying on a single one.
Right, because there are lots of different ways to measure fairness.
Right, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses.
And they might be more or less relevant depending on your specific use case.
Exactly.
And your context.
So he mentioned things like disparate impact, equal opportunity difference.
Okay.
And then carefully comparing those against the baseline accuracy.
Right.
Or the F1 score.
So you've got your performance metrics. And you've got your fairness metric.
And you're looking at them together.
And you're trying to find that balance. Right. That sweet spot where you're getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and I thought one of the most insightful things he shared was a specific example.
Okay, I love those concrete examples because they really bring these things to life.
So he talked about using an adversarial debiasing approach.
Okay.
That's a more sophisticated technique.
Yeah, it's not just your basic.
Right. And he was very upfront that this resulted in a 2% dip
Okay.
in their F1 score.
So a slight decrease in performance.
Yeah.
But in return.
But they have the key measure of demographic disparity.
So a significant improvement in fairness.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the important thing here is that it wasn't just the ML engineers who made this decision.
Right.
He really emphasized that they collaborated with the product owners and the compliance teams to define what was an acceptable trade-off.
Because it's not just a technical decision.
No.
It's a business decision.
It's a business decision. It's an ethical decision.
And it's a social decision. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think for our listeners, what's really important here is that this highlights that building ML systems, it's not just about chasing that absolute peak accuracy.
No.
It's about understanding these nuances, these trade-offs.
And making those informed decisions.
And doing it collaboratively.
Collaboratively, yeah.
And with different stakeholders.
And different perspectives. Because everybody brings something to the table.
Yeah, so we talked about governance, we talked about bias mitigation. Let's move on to something that's been generating a lot of buzz lately.
Okay, what's that?
Generative AI.
Oh, yeah, that's the hot topic.
And large language models.
LLMs, everybody's talking about it.
Everybody's talking about them. So Abinash specifically asked Tarun about his experience in this area.
Okay.
And, his familiarity with different frameworks and models.
Yeah, because there's a lot out there.
There's a lot out there.
And it's changing so quickly.
It's changing so quickly.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up.
It's hard to keep up. And he had to talk about his strategies for handling some of those unique challenges.
Okay.
Like hallucinations.
Right, where the model just makes stuff up.
Yeah, and managing those computational costs.
Oh, yeah, because those can get out of control quickly.
Especially with those large language models.
Yeah.
So it was pretty clear that Tarun had a strong grasp of this space.
Okay, that's good. That's what you want to see.
Yeah, he mentioned PyTorch, TensorFlow.
Okay, those are the big frameworks.
Yeah, he's worked with GPT-4, Llama 2, Falcon.
Oh, wow. So he's got experience with all the latest models.
Yeah, and he also mentioned Hugging Face Transformers.
Okay. That's a great library for working with LLMs.
It is, yeah.
Makes it a lot easier.
So I think this was one of those moments where it's like, okay.
He knows his stuff.
This guy's got a really solid foundation.
Yeah.
And he shared a really specific use case that I thought was pretty interesting.
Okay. What's that?
He talked about building an internal knowledge-based chatbot using Llama 2.
At Data Core Analytics.
Yeah, so this is like a classic application of LLMs within organizations.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Right, but it comes with its own challenges.
Yeah, like I said, hallucinations.
Hallucinations, exactly.
Right, where the model just
makes stuff up.
Yeah, confidently gives you wrong information.
Right.
Which can be a big problem.
So how do they approach this?
Yeah, I'm curious to know how they tackled that.
Well, they did a few things.
Okay.
First, they implemented retrieval augmented generation.
Right.
RAG, yeah. So basically they enhanced the LLM by feeding it relevant external documents.
Okay, so it's not just relying on its own internal knowledge.
No.
It's got some extra context.
It's got extra context.
Yeah.
So it's more likely to give grounded answers.
Right. It's grounding its responses in actual information.
And they used LangChain to simplify this process.
Okay. LangChain's a great framework for building these kinds of applications. It makes it a lot easier.
And they also did something that I thought was really smart.
Okay.
They built in a user feedback loop.
Okay, so users can actually give feedback on the model's responses.
So it was just a simple button, report incorrect answer.
Okay, I've seen those before.
Yeah, so this directly feeds back into their fine-tuning process.
Right, so they're constantly improving the model.
Yeah, and they're identifying areas where it's prone to making errors.
So it's like a continuous learning loop.
It is.
Powered by the users.
And of course, they had to think about cost optimization.
Oh, yeah, because those LLMs can be expensive to run.
So they utilized Spot GPU instances on AWS.
Okay, so they're taking advantage of those discounts for unused capacity.
And they applied model quantization.
Okay, so that's a technique to reduce the precision of the model's parameters.
Yeah, and he mentioned that this resulted in about a 30% reduction in memory usage.
Okay, so that's a big win for efficiency.
It is, yeah, so all of these things combined.
They're really thinking about those operational costs.
Yeah.
From the start.
But it wasn't just about cost, right? They also had a strong focus on evaluation.
Okay, that's crucial.
Yeah, and they used metrics that went beyond the standard BLEU score.
Right, because BLEU is not always the best metric for these kinds of generative models.
So they also incorporated RUG.
Okay.
which focuses on text overlap.
Okay, so it's looking at how similar the generated text is.
For the reference text.
Right.
And crucially, they did human A/B tests.
Oh, okay, so they're actually getting feedback from real people.
Yeah, because at the end of the day,
Yeah,
the user experience matters.
it does. Yeah,
And you need to know how these models are performing in the real world.
absolutely.
So what were the results of all this?
Yeah, I'm dying to know, did it actually pay off?
They saw a 40% decrease in hallucinations,
Wow.
validated by those human reviewers.
Okay, so they're not just relying on automated metrics, they're actually getting human feedback.
They also saw a 20% improvement in inference latency.
Okay, so the models are responding faster, which is great for the user experience.
Exactly. And a 25% monthly saving on their inference costs.
Okay, so they're saving money and improving performance.
It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, it really is.
And I think this really highlights
Yeah.
how this field is rapidly evolving.
Yeah, it's moving so fast.
There are all these new challenges.
Yeah.
And they're figuring out how to solve them.
Yeah, it's exciting.
It's really exciting.
It is.
So, we've got all this data
Yeah.
being processed by these generative AI models and all these other ML systems.
Yeah.
We have to talk about data handling and compliance.
Oh, yeah. That's crucial.
Because this stuff is so important these days.
It is, yeah.
Especially with all the regulations and all the concerns about privacy.
Absolutely.
So Abinash rightly asked Tarun about how he ensured they were adhering to things like GDPR
Yeah, the General Data Protection Regulation.
and how they were handling PII.
Personally identifiable information.
Yeah.
So, like, how are you keeping people's data safe?
Yeah, how are you being responsible with this data?
Yeah.
And Tarun's response showed that he really understood
Right.
this aspect of responsible AI development.
Good. That's what you want to hear.
Yeah, so he talked about having a really robust PII redaction process
Okay.
in place
So they're removing any sensitive information.
before they even train the models.
Okay, so it's not even getting into the system in the first place.
Right. They also had really strong encryption measures.
Okay, that's good.
They used AWS Key Management Service,
KMS?
KMS, to encrypt the data at rest.
Okay, so when it's just sitting there stored.
Transport layer security,
TLS.
TLS, to encrypt it in transit.
So when it's moving around the network.
Yeah, so they're covering all the bases.
Yeah, they're really taking security seriously.
But it wasn't just about the technical safeguards.
Okay.
They also had internal data governance checklists.
Okay, so they're making sure they're following their own policies.
Right.
Consistently.
And for data, that was subject to GDPR. They had automated workflows
Okay.
for data expiry and anonymization.
So they're not just keeping the data forever.
Right.
They're actually getting rid of it.
When they don't need it anymore.
Or making it anonymous.
Yeah.
So you can't identify individuals anymore.
So this is a really proactive approach.
Yeah, it's not just reacting to regulations.
It's about building privacy and compliance into the system from the start.
Exactly.
So another important area that Abinash asked Tarun about was staying up to date.
Staying current.
Yeah, with the state-of-the-art in ML techniques.
Yeah, because this field is constantly evolving.
It's constantly evolving.
There's always something new coming out.
Yeah, so how do you keep up?
Yeah, how do you stay ahead of the curve?
So Tarun's approach was exactly what you would expect
Okay.
from someone who's deeply engaged in the field.
Uh-huh.
He mentioned reading research papers on RTIR.
Okay, that's where a lot of the latest research gets published.
Yeah.
Before it even goes to conferences.
Attending major conference talks.
Like NeuroPS, ICML,
Yeah.
those are the big ones.
And actively participating in ML communities.
Okay, so networking, sharing knowledge.
Yeah, learning from others.
Yeah.
And he even shared a couple of specific areas that he's been exploring lately.
Okay, I'm always curious about that.
Yeah, so he's been looking into diffusion models.
Okay, those are really popular for image generation these days.
Yeah, he's using Hugging Face diffusers.
Okay, that's a great library for working with diffusion models.
And he sees the potential for these models to augment existing data sets.
Yeah, especially when you have limited data.
Which is often the case.
Yeah, real-world data can be hard to come by.
He also mentioned graph neural networks.
GNNs.
GNNs, yeah.
Those are really powerful for modeling relationships.
Yeah, and he thinks they could be really useful for building more sophisticated recommendation systems.
Okay, yeah, I can see how those would be applicable.
Especially if you're dealing with a lot of user item interactions.
Right, like in an e-commerce setting or social media.
So this really shows how he's staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, he's not just focusing on what's popular today.
Right.
He's thinking about what's going to be important tomorrow.
Exactly.
And that's a crucial quality for a leader.
So for our listeners, I think the takeaway here is that
Yeah,
continuous learning is essential
absolutely.
if you want to stay relevant in this field.
Yeah, you got to keep learning,
Keep learning
keep growing.
and keep exploring.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
Performance optimization
Oh, yeah, that's always a good one.
and cost management,
Especially in the cloud.
especially in the cloud, right?
Yeah, those costs can add up quickly.
So Abinash asked Tarun about his strategies for addressing latency
Okay.
and optimizing resource utilization.
So making things run faster and cheaper?
And cheaper.
Okay, that's the dream.
It is the dream.
Yeah.
So Tarun provided a really comprehensive breakdown of his approach.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So he talked about model quantization.
Okay, both post-training and quantization aware.
Yeah, weight pruning.
Yeah.
Okay, getting rid of those unnecessary connections.
Knowledge distillation.
Okay, so training a smaller model to mimic a larger one.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And he highlighted the importance of using optimized inference engines.
Like ONNX, runtime, TensorRT.
Yeah, those can make a big difference.
Yeah, they're designed for efficiency.
And he didn't forget the basics, like efficient pre-processing and leveraging caching within data pipelines.
Right, those are foundational.
Yeah, so he's got this whole toolbox of strategies.
Yeah, he's thinking about it from all angles.
For tackling latency.
Yeah.
And when it came to managing costs,
Okay.
he had some equally practical ideas.
Okay, like what?
So he talked about optimizing cloud resource utilization through auto-scaling on Kubernetes.
Okay, so you're only using the resources you need
Exactly.
when you need them.
And being strategic about selecting instance types.
Okay, so knowing when to use GPUs, when to use CPUs.
Yeah, when to use on-demand instances versus spot instances.
Yeah, spot instances.
Right, those can be a lot cheaper.
But they're a little bit riskier.
Yeah, you might not always get the capacity you need.
Right.
You have to be careful.
And he even shared a concrete example
Okay, I love those.
from a real-time object detection pipeline
Okay.
where they achieved a 30% reduction in latency
Wow.
and a 25% decrease in their AWS cloud costs
Okay, so they're saving money and improving performance.
by using a combination of quantization and strategic instance selection.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
So it's not just theory.
No.
He's actually done it
He's actually done it.
in the real world.
And he stressed the importance of having a cost monitoring dashboard
Okay, so you can track those costs over time.
and make sure you're staying within budget.
And make sure your optimizations are actually working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this really shows that he's not just a technical expert.
Right, yeah.
He understands the business side of things.
Yeah, he's thinking about the bottom line.
And he's thinking about how to deliver value.
To the organization.
Yeah.
That's a valuable skill.
So let's shift gears now and talk about leadership.
Okay.
Because this was a big part of the interview.
It was.
Avinash presented Tarun with a scenario
Okay.
where he was leading a 10-person ML engineering team.
Okay.
And they were facing a production issue.
Okay. I've been there.
We've all been there.
Yeah, those production issues can be stressful.
So the situation was this.
Mm-hmm.
The client was reporting a spike in cart abandonment rates
Okay, that's not.
during promotional events.
So people are adding items to their cart,
Yeah.
but then they're not completing the purchase.
And the data suggested that their recommendation system
Was not performing well.
was a big part of the problem.
Okay, so they're losing.